All right, let's dive into the incredible world of motor control. I mean, think about it. How does a simple thought like grabbing your morning coffee turn into this perfectly coordinated sequence of muscle actions? It's this amazing system of planning, coordination, and execution. And in this explainer, we're going to build the complete architectural blueprint for how it all works, from the highest levels of the brain all the way down to your muscle.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with the overall hierarchy of motor control. Then we're going to zoom right in on the command center, the cerebral motor cortex. After that, we'll trace the highways that carry those commands, what we call the descending pathways. Then we'll explore the absolutely crucial role of the basal ganglia. In our fifth section, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of movement modulation, dissecting the key direct and indirect pathways. And finally, we'll look at what happens when this beautifully intricate system goes wrong.
Okay, first up, the chain of command. The motor system isn't just one big thing. No, it's a highly organized hierarchy. You've got different levels of the brain and spinal cord, and each one plays its own distinct and really critical role.
This diagram really lays it all out for us. So at the very top, you have the motor cortex. This is where the planning, the initiation, and the directing of voluntary movements happen. But it's not working alone. Right alongside it, you have the basal ganglia, which kind of acts like a gatekeeper for starting the right movements, and the cerebellum, which is all about coordinating sensory input with motor output, and, this is key, correcting errors on the fly. These top-tier centers send their signals down to the brainstem, which handles more basic stuff like posture. And finally, all these commands funnel down to the spinal cord and brainstem circuits. These are the lower motor neurons that are actually telling our muscles what to do.
So the big picture is this top-down control. At the peak, you have the cerebral cortex, which includes areas like the primary motor cortex and premotor cortex. This area runs what's known as the pyramidal system for voluntary movement. Just below that, the brainstem is the origin point for the extrapyramidal pathways, which handle more automatic functions. And at the bottom, the spinal cord is the final command pathway. But listen, it's not just a simple relay cable. It's its own executive center for reflexes and generating basic patterns. And it's constantly being fine-tuned by those higher-up bosses.
All right, let's move on to section 2 and really zoom in on the brain's command center, the cerebral motor cortex. It's located in the frontal lobe, just in front of the central sulcus. And this is where the highest-level decisions about our movements are made and put into action. The motor cortex is basically made up of 3 key areas. First, you see it here in blue, is the primary motor cortex, or M1. It's located right on the precentral gyrus, and it's the final point of execution. Just in front of that, on the lateral side, is the premotor cortex, or PMA. And then on the medial surface, we have the supplementary motor cortex, or SMA. Both of these, the premotor and supplementary areas, are incredibly important for the planning stages of a movement.
So how does a movement actually get started? Well, first, the brain needs intel. It has to have sensory input about your body's position, plus visual and somatosensory data before it can even think about planning. Then, a movement can be triggered externally, say by a sensory stimulus. In that case, the information just gets passed from the sensory cortex to the motor cortex. Or it can be initiated internally. This could be driven by an emotion coming from the limbic system, or it could be a totally conscious decision that you make in your frontal and parietal cortex.
And this is one of the most famous images in all of neuroscience, the motor homunculus. It's this bizarre, distorted map of the body that shows you exactly how the primary motor cortex dedicates its resources. I mean, just look how huge the hands, fingers, lips, and tongue are compared to the trunk or the legs. And that's the whole point. The amount of brain surface area given to a body part is all about the precision of its movement, not its actual physical size. That's why areas for clunkier movements, like your thigh, get way less brain real estate.
Now for a really key detail about its structure, the motor cortex is what we call agranular. And what does that mean? Well, it means it doesn't have a well-defined granular layer, which is layer IV. That layer, which is usually the main input layer for sensory info, is super thin here. But in contrast, layer V, the primary output layer, is incredibly thick. This layer is packed with these giant neurons called BET cells, and their axons make up a huge chunk, about 30% of the main output highway that carries motor commands down to the spinal cord.
Okay, so what about those secondary motor cortices? Their job is to handle the planning and fleshing out of motor commands. The premotor cortex is mostly about planning movement sequences in response to external sensory cues. It's especially important for things like seeing an object and then planning how to grasp it. The supplementary motor cortex, on the other hand, deals with movements that are generated internally, based on thought. It's also vital for coordinating movements on both sides of your body. And here's a really cool breakdown. For a simple command, only the primary motor cortex fires up. For a complex sequence, both the primary and supplementary areas activate. But if you just think about doing that complex sequence without actually moving a muscle, only the supplementary motor cortex lights up. How cool is that? So the command has been planned and crafted up in the cortex. What happens next? Well, our third section is all about the descending motor pathways. These are the superhighways that carry those commands from the brain all the way down to the spinal cord and ultimately to your muscles.
There are really two major systems you need to know about. First is the corticospinal system, also called the pyramidal system. This is your pathway for conscious, voluntary movements. It starts in the cortex, it's in charge of fine motor skills, and its axons do this famous crossover, or decussate, down in the medulla. The second system is the extrapyramidal system. This one's for all the involuntary stuff, posture, reflexes, you name it. It doesn't start in the cortex, it originates in the brainstem, and it's made up of a bunch of different tracts, like the rubrospinal and tectospinal tracts.
Let's actually trace that corticospinal tract. The journey starts with the upper motor neurons in the precentral gyrus. Their axons travel down through the brain and form these huge bundles of white matter in the medulla called the pyramids. Now this is where the main event happens, the decussation of the pyramids. This is the spot where most of those fibers cross over to the opposite side of the body. After crossing, the tract splits. The lateral corticospinal tract goes on to control your limb muscles, while a smaller, anterior part stays on the same side to control the muscles of your trunk, which is obviously essential for posture. Now let's look at a couple of those key extrapyramidal tracts that start in the brainstem. First, we've got the colliculospinal tract. This pathway is absolutely vital for moving your head and neck in response to a stimulus, like when you hear a loud bang and you whip your head around. Next to it, we see the rubrospinal tract. This one projects from a spot called the red nucleus, and in us humans, it mainly helps control our arms by relaying information from the cortex to the cerebellum.
And staying in that extrapyramidal system, we have the reticulospinal tract. It starts in the reticular formation, and its whole job is to control your trunk muscles to manage things like posture, muscle tone, and just getting around. And finally, the vestibulospinal tracts. These guys get their input from the vestibular system deep in your inner ear, and they are 100% critical for keeping your balance and posture while you're moving. Okay, this brings us to one of the biggest players in motor modulation, the basal ganglia. The best way to think about these deep brain structures is as the brain's gatekeeper for movement. They don't start the movement themselves, but they are absolutely essential for giving the go or no-go signal to the cortex. This image gives us a fantastic look at the anatomy. The basal ganglia are this collection of subcortical nuclei. You can clearly see some of the main structures here. There's the big C-shaped caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus tucked away deeper inside. These guys, plus a few others, work together to form a really complex circuit that refines all of our motor output. All right, let's break down the 5 core nuclei that make this all happen. First, the main input zone is the striatum, and that's made up of 2 parts, the caudate and the putamen. Now, a quick terminology note. If you combine the striatum with the globus pallidus, that bigger structure is called the corpus striatum. Okay, so the globus pallidus itself is also split into 2 parts, an internal segment, or GPI, and an external segment, or GPE. Then we've got the substantia nigra in the midbrain, which also has 2 parts. The pars compacta, this is the one that supplies the all-important dopamine, and the pars reticulata. And finally, there's the subthalamic nucleus. Those 5 nuclei are the heart and soul of the basal ganglia circuitry. So how does this gatekeeper actually work? Well, it all boils down to 2 competing circuits inside the basal ganglia, the direct and the indirect pathways. If you can get your head around these 2, you'll understand exactly how the basal ganglia can both kickstart and shut down movement. Let's start with the baseline, when nothing's happening. As you can see in this diagram, when you're just sitting still, the output nucleus of the basal ganglia, that's the globus pallidus, labeled B, is tonically active. That just means it's constantly firing, constantly putting the brakes on the thalamus, labeled C. This non-stop inhibition prevents the thalamus from getting the motor cortex, D, all excited. So the key idea is this. At rest, the basal ganglia's default setting is to prevent you from making a bunch of unwanted movements. Okay, so how do you actually start a movement? The cortex sends a go signal to the striatum, which is A. This fires up the striatum, which then sends a powerful but very brief stop signal to the globus pallidus, B. For just a split second, this shuts the globus pallidus down. And this is the magic moment. By stopping the stopper, you release the brakes on the thalamus, C. We call this disinhibition. The thalamus is now free to excite the motor cortex, D, and boom, the movement you wanted to make can happen.
This whole process is managed by two pathways that are basically in a constant tug of war. The direct pathway, which we just walked through, is what activates movement. The signal goes from the striatum to the GPI, then to the thalamus, and its job is to disinhibit the thalamus so movement can start. The indirect pathway does the exact opposite. It turns movement down. Its route is a bit more complicated. It goes from the striatum to the GPE, then to the subthalamic nucleus, and finally to the GPI. The whole point of this longer loop is to basically boost the inhibitory output of the GPI, which helps suppress unwanted movements.
And what's the secret sauce that fine-tunes this whole balance? Dopamine. Dopamine, which comes from the substantia nigra, has this amazing dual role that basically makes it easier to move. It acts on two different kinds of receptors in the striatum. On the direct pathway neurons, which have D1 receptors, dopamine acts like a gas pedal. It's excitatory. But on the indirect pathway neurons, which have D2 receptors, dopamine acts like a brake. It's inhibitory. So by hitting the gas on the go pathway and hitting the brakes on the stop pathway, dopamine biases the whole system towards making movement happen.
And that brings us to our final section. What happens when this perfectly balanced system goes haywire? When the basal ganglia aren't working right, it leads to some of the most well-known and often devastating movement disorders out there.
Generally speaking, these disorders fall into two big buckets. First, you have hypokinesia. That literally means less movement. The main symptom is a major difficulty in starting voluntary movements, and the classic example, of course, is Parkinson's disease. The total opposite of that is hyperkinesia, or excess movement, which is characterized by all these uncontrolled involuntary movements. The prime example here is Huntington's disease.
Let's look at the mechanism behind Parkinson's. The root cause is the death of those dopamine-making neurons in the substantia nigra. Without enough dopamine, that delicate balance is completely thrown off. The indirect stop pathway becomes overactive while the direct go pathway gets weaker. And the consequence? The inhibitory output from the basal ganglia goes way up. There's way more tonic inhibition being slammed onto the thalamus, which makes it incredibly hard to start movements. It's a failure of that disinhibition we talked about.
Huntington's disease, in a lot of ways, is the mirror image. The problem here is a heritable disease that causes the loss of specific neurons in the striatum, mostly the ones that kick off the indirect pathway. So the mechanism is a total disruption of this stop pathway. This leads to less tonic inhibition on the thalamus and way too much unwanted activity between the thalamus and the cortex. The result is hyperkinesia, those uncontrollable jerky movements we call chorea, as well as a tragic cognitive decline.
And we'll wrap up with one last kind of mind-bending thought. Neuroscientists have discovered something called a readiness potential. It's a buildup of electrical activity that you can detect in the premotor cortex about half a second before a person is even consciously aware that they've decided to make a move. So the question this leaves us with is this. If your brain starts preparing a movement long before your conscious self decides to act, is our sense of free will just an illusion? Something to chew on.